Vietnam is celebrating the 40th anniversary of its official membership in the UN. Now, how has the relationship or the partnership between Vietnam and the UN developed over the years? How has the UN contributed to Vietnam? And what are the future directions of this partnership? Today, we'll find out the answer together with the help and the assistance of our great company here today. First, we have Mr. Kamal Malhotra, who is currently the UN resident coordinator in Vietnam. And then we have Ambassador Nguyễn Quý Bính, who used to serve for Vietnam at the UN in Geneva and New York as well. Thank you very much for taking your precious time to be here with us today. I've done some research and I found out that some UN organizations actually started working in Vietnam way before Vietnam actually became an official member of the UN. Can you tell us more about this?
The UN has, in many situations, recognizing the urgency of humanitarian response, been able to operate in countries, situations, parts of countries which are not under government control because of the emergency situation and the urgent need, particularly when it comes to children and to women. This is something that cuts across all political boundaries.
Despite the fact that Vietnam had already been an independent country for 30 years, Vietnam was not able to become an official member of the UN in 1975 and 1976 as their applications were turned down. Now, in 1977, this was actually made possible. So how come Vietnam was able to do this in 1977 and how did it happen? Let's check out the following package.
On the 14th of January 1946, President Ho Chi Minh sent a telegram to representatives of the US, USSR and China at the United Nations to request recognition of the independence of Vietnam and its admissions to the UN. But only after 2 long wars in 1975, when Vietnam was reunited, was the journey of Vietnam to the UN continued. In this photo are Đinh Bá Thi and Nguyễn Văn Lưu, the 2 ambassadors representing a not yet united Vietnam, with their interpreters, press officer Phạm Ngạc to their right. This was in 1975 when Vietnam first made physical appearance at the United Nations to hand in the applications.
Khi đã thống nhất rồi thì cả miền Nam miền Bắc cử sang lập cái cơ quan đại diện ở bên đó gọi là quan sát viên. Cơ quan quan sát viên tại Liên Hợp Quốc, và chúng tôi lúc đó là cũng được tham gia ở đấy hoạt động. Và trong suốt thời gian đó thì chúng tôi được cái số Việt kiều bạn bè Mỹ giúp đỡ rất nhiều, vì lúc đó là cái hạn chế về tài chính chúng tôi rất khó khăn, chỉ có 3 người thôi, về phương tiện hoạt động hạn chế. Mẹ Teresa đấy cũng đã đến ăn cơm với chúng tôi. 123 nước là quyết định là Hội đồng Bảo an phải chấp nhận ngay Việt Nam vào Liên Hợp Quốc. Nhưng mà thế nên chúng tôi phải xếp 1 năm nữa mới được cái Mỹ đấu tranh với Mỹ.
Việt Nam và Mỹ lúc đó cũng bắt đầu có những cái tiến triển, đặc biệt là trong cái tìm hiểu cái thông tin, cung cấp những thông tin về các binh sĩ Mỹ bị mất tích ở Việt Nam. Thì lúc đó chính quyền Carter cũng đã gửi đặc phái viên sang làm việc với Việt Nam và Việt Nam cũng đã đáp ứng. Thì qua những cái đáp ứng này thì chính quyền Carter lúc đấy cũng có một cái quyết định là rất là mạnh mẽ, chiến lược chuyển đổi, là muốn đặt cái quá khứ, quên quá khứ để mà nhìn vào hướng vào tương lai. Thì lúc đó cũng đã ra tín hiệu là sẽ không phủ quyết Việt Nam nữa.
Cái ngày kết nạp thì là ngày hôm trước, ngày 20 tháng 9, Đại hội đồng thông qua, mà thông qua không bỏ phiếu, vỗ tay hoan nghênh. Thế hôm sau thì mới làm lễ thượng cờ, thì 9 giờ sáng, cái ngày 21 làm thượng cờ. Thì lần đó là kết nạp được cả với Djibouti và Việt Nam. Thì lúc đó là mới số bạn Mỹ mới nói rằng là Việt Nam đã vào Liên Hợp Quốc bằng cửa chính, tự mình mở đường vào Liên Hợp Quốc.
The years immediately after joining the UN, projects worth millions of dollars were set up and carried out in vigor by both sides.
Từ 77 cho đến 79 là một cái giai đoạn là có rất nhiều các tổ chức quốc tế có viện trợ cho Việt Nam trên tất cả các mặt, mà tập trung vào là khôi phục sau chiến tranh và viện trợ khẩn cấp. Ví dụ như là lương thực thực phẩm, và thuốc men, các cái trang thiết bị cho nhà trường, cho học sinh và các cái lĩnh vực yêu cầu khác trong xã hội, đặc biệt là phụ nữ và trẻ em.
What was the significance of Vietnam becoming an official member of the UN in relation to its independence?
That is the result of the fight, Vietnamese people have, conducting the struggle for more than 30 years. That is the signal that Vietnam now enjoy political independence as a member of the UN. After all, the long fight for national independence.
Why is it that it took Vietnam so long to gain this membership that it was so eager for since its declaration of independence?
For some country, when they got independent, they joined the UN, an easy path. For Vietnam, we had to fight for independence, because it is historical circumstances, that led to the fight. We fought against the French domination. Okay, after the World War II, we got the independence, but we had no recognition from the US and other Western countries, But, until Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and then the liberation of Saigon in 1975, after a long war. It means, really something for people of Vietnam and Vietnam. Now we got the independence, our recognition, and become a member. So the situation, different from some other countries where everything goes smoothly.
Right after the American war in Vietnam ended, the first UN agency to arrive in the country was UNICEF. It was actually very important that they came at this time. Now, their work represents the primary support that the United Nations has provided to Vietnam from the beginning till now. So, let's take a closer look at what they have contributed to the country.
Vietnam officially joined the United Nations in 1977, but UNICEF presence in Vietnam started in July 1975.
Tôi rất nhớ rất rõ là vào những năm 1970, UNICEF hỗ trợ về mặt các trang thiết bị cho phòng thí nghiệm, rồi các phương tiện cho việc giám sát các bệnh truyền nhiễm và đào tạo cán bộ. Phải nói là sau những cái hỗ trợ đó thì là cái năng lực của hệ thống dự phòng được tăng lên rất là rõ rệt cho việc kiểm soát giám sát các bệnh tật.
Professor Hoàng Thủy Nguyên, former head of the National Institute of Hygiene and Epidemiology, worked directly with UNICEF professionals at the time. He believes UNICEF provided very basic support for the preventive health system.
Vào một buổi tối mùa đông năm 1975, giáo sư Nozarang, Ủy ban Hợp tác Khoa học của Pháp với Việt Nam, giới thiệu tiến sĩ Simon Spivak, phụ trách UNICEF, về kế hoạch. Và thế là sau đó, tôi với lại Simon Spivak thống nhất rằng là mau chóng phải thiết lập một hệ thống y tế dự phòng trong cả nước, và tỷ lệ mắc bệnh truyền nhiễm giảm xuống thì làm nhẹ cái gánh nặng cho vấn đề điều trị và chăm sóc. Và nhờ vậy chúng ta có thể đi sâu vào được y học.
UNICEF support provided a foundation for Vietnam to build and promote its preventive health system in 63 provinces and 700 communes and towns. To date, the preventive health system can successfully implement its immunization program and raise public awareness on hygiene and disease prevention.
Can you share with us what were some of the greatest obstacles that the UN-Vietnam partnership experienced at the beginning, during the 80s, when the UN was trying to support Vietnam?
Well, of course, resources were not adequate to deal with the range of challenges that any country faces after being at war for so long. I think Of course, we had other challenges, which was including attracting the best staff to come here at that time. And in fact, the UN International School was set up here in the late 80s, mainly to be able to address the needs of staff, and so that we could attract some of our best staff who have come to Vietnam over the years. There was, of course, other challenges of being still very much in an isolated sort of context. And, you know, that is always challenging in terms of bringing in equipment, bringing in what you need to bring in. The lack of a legal framework in many respects was, you know, a challenge. But of course, part of the UN's role was to help with that. So these are some of the challenges we faced.
The UN, helped Vietnam, politically, that it is an international organization to help Vietnam after the war engage in international affairs. One of the only, big four international forum for Vietnam to work at that time was through the UN. Vietnam has not joined many international organizations as today. But at that time, the UN provided a lot of technical assistance. UN also play a very important role, helping Vietnam to make some breakthrough in the relationship with other countries, Western countries, is also with the US. We have a permanent there, so it become a place for Vietnam to look into outside the war, and also the place for UN to channel to the aid to Vietnam.
In 1986 actually was an important milestone in Vietnam's history as the country embarked on the journey of Đổi mới, or the renovation period. Now, this process marked many important reforms, many changes, brought many important changes to the country at the time. What was the UN's role in this period? Would you like to share with us?
Okay, during this period, the UN can give more of the assistance because the reform has, give a new atmosphere for the people of the country. The development of social and economic condition also help the promote the UN's assistance and UN's role in many aspects: education, healthcare, the social scheme like medical, insurance development, and school assistance for children, water supply, clean water supply for population. So together with the political and the spirit of people, UN assistance also help, being promoted, and that echo together with the political reaction from outside. Now people look at the country with a different view, and also with the effectiveness of the assistance. So step by step, especially in the early years of reform, that was so important.
So Kamal, drawing from your own knowledge too, do you know what role the UN actually played in contributing to Vietnam's Đổi mới period?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to people who were here at that time, and I've looked at some of the documents, and it seems to me that the most important contribution the UN's made at that time was to help with the design of Đổi mới, bringing development experiences from other countries, as well as offering policy advice in a neutral manner. I think the neutrality of the UN is critical for trust being built by any government. And I think at that time, given the history, the neutrality of the UN in bringing best practices from around the world, best expertise from around the world, and sharing options. In the end, the government has to make the decision which options to choose. But in terms of getting access to those options, what has worked, what has not worked, what we advise for the design of this major transformation program, Doimoi, I think the UN played a significant role from everything I've read and seen.
So after the first few years of the official membership of Vietnam at the UN, the partnership between Vietnam and the UN transitioned from a focus on emergency aid to capacity building. Now, there was a man who witnessed all of this as he was a UN official who has been involved with Vietnam since 1983. So who may he be? Let's meet him in the following package and learn about his story and reflections on the 30 years working for Vietnam and the UN.
I'm particularly happy that, having been associated with Vietnam for almost 40 years, that I can celebrate with others this cooperation between the people and the government of Vietnam and UNDP. When I first visited Vietnam in 1983, I was working for the Food and Agricultural Organization, and I undertook a second mission in 1984. I arrived in Hanoi to take up an assignment as deputy representative of UNDP. By that time had my wife, Chinti Bích Liên, and she followed me then for 20 years in different countries.
Terence Jones was among the first representatives of UNDP to Vietnam after 1975, but he might be the one with the longest and closest connection to the country. Terence devoted his life to UNDP in nations around the world, including Vietnam. Over time, he witnessed many dramatic changes.
Of course, much has changed in those 40 years, and in particular, when I first visited Vietnam in 1983, it was still very much recovering from decades of conflict. I became familiar with how UNDP started its cooperation in 1977, and because many of the projects that were initiated in the aftermath of reunification to support the new nation were still continuing when I joined to live in Hanoi in 1984. So I became very familiar with the first 10 years of cooperation between UNDP and the government of Vietnam.
After 40 years with UNDP, Vietnam has a special meaning for Terence. He has a Vietnamese family here. He went through the milestone Đổi Mới renovation, in which UNDP projects supported important reforms in administration, government, and the economy. Since 1987, when he finished his term in UNDP Vietnam, Terence and his wife returned to visit the country each year until he chose to live here in 2008.
Well, Mr. Terence, can we say just you fall in love with Vietnam at the first sight? Please share with me about your beginning days, the first impression in my country.
Of course, that's a long time ago, but I'm very happy that you think of me as a son-in-law of Vietnam, because it's a big part of my life. I think the first phase is always the most memorable, because that is your first impression. I was working there, therefore I had a lot of intensive activity. I was exposed to many different personalities in government. I visited many parts of Vietnam. Whereas in the second phase, and of course I met my wife in that period, it was what was not a particularly easy environment in which to be romantic. Of course, at that time, it was very different from today. People wore clothes that were more or less of the same color, because the availability of cloth was very restricted. What I felt at the time was that the government officials we worked with were very committed to making the very best use of every dollar that the United Nations was able to provide in terms of equipment, training, expertise. So basically those first 10 years, the program was focused on trying to help the government establish or re-establish major national institutions to support development. So agricultural research, plant protection, veterinary services, construction capacities in various dimensions. So these very large projects were really trying to re-establish the foundation for the socialist economy.
So after your working term in Vietnam and in 1987, right? You traveled 10 years around the world, and then 1997 around you go back to Vietnam. It must be in a different phase of the country, like with the blooming economy, and when Vietnam is integrating to the world. How you see the changes?
It's until 1993, when the embargo broke, we saw the continuing difficulties that the country faced in terms of trying to cope with increasing population, shortage of resources, and the great difficulties it brought to the people, including in Hanoi. So that period in 88 to 93 was a very, very difficult one for the people of Vietnam and for the government to try to continue to meet the demands for education, health, and foodstuffs and so forth. On the other hand, you know, because of the the change in government policy, you also noticed much more private sector activity, small-scale private sector activity. So those changes started gradually, and I think the government looked at the results, and Doi Moi was a reflection of that. You still see a lot of strong cultural traditions that are being maintained, or the very strong, you know, sense of importance of the family and the ancestors of the family. I hope that, you know, the young people, particularly those in urban areas, do not lose some of that attachment to the past, because it gives you strength, it gives you a lot of moral support in what is a very challenging world today.
Let me thank you. Thank you very much for all your love and all your work and your support with Vietnam.
So now looking back at the 40 years of, you know, the partnership between the UN and Vietnam, what do you think have been some of the most crucial achievements that the UN and Vietnam have made together?
Oh, the major achievement, that is a very fruitful cooperation between the UN organization agencies and Vietnam in all aspects, from the humanitarian assistance efforts, and later on other social and economic, and now the strategic and political aspect. So that is the one of the model, you know, of cooperation, not only for only Vietnam, but I think it's also a good model for other countries. That is, to me, it is an example of good cooperation between Vietnam and the UN. Very comprehensive, very consistent for a long period, and continue to nurture, you know, during the future.
So how about the Millennium Development Goals too? How well did Vietnam perform in carrying out these?
Well, Vietnam performed very well in global comparative terms, in terms of achieving the Millennium Development Goals, many of them in advance of the deadline, because the deadline for those goals was 2015. And I believe Vietnam, I wasn't here then, but I believe Vietnam achieved many of them in advance. For example, the poverty reduction goal. Also, I think some of the goals to do with education and health. But the Millennium Development Goals were less challenging than our current agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we call Agenda 2030. And so I think, you know, the Millennium Development Goals achievement went hand in hand with the transformation that took place in 25 years after Doi Moi in 1986. The bigger challenge now is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. These are much more complex. These are much more interconnected. They are much more human rights based. And I think there will need to be much more significant levels of reform to achieve those. But on the Millennium Development Goals, Vietnam should be very proud of its record. Well, now talking about a more recent period over the last 10 years, I think Vietnam can be proud of having been in the forefront of UN reform on the ground through the what we call the Delivering as One or the One UN initiative. This started in 2006 globally. There were 8 pilot countries and Vietnam was one of them. And it has really been at the forefront of those 8 for that period, and I hope that it will continue to be so. I'm certainly sort of keeping up or taking further the momentum on that. And I think that is an important contribution that Vietnam and its leadership has made to the UN, because it's been able to demonstrate that with strong government leadership and ownership, you can have a UN system working as one more effectively on the ground. The government also has, of course, provided us with rent-free facilities in the Green One UN House that are offices for most UN agencies in Hanoi, right in the center of the city. That is an important contribution as well, because that building becomes a facilitator for many other UN reforms at the country level. So I can certainly point to all of these as contributions that Vietnam has made in the more recent period to give back to the relationship, because in the first 20 years, 30 years, it was more the UN. But I think increasingly Vietnam is giving back to this partnership and this relationship. And, you know, I think another area for the future, which certainly I'm very keen on supporting, is Vietnam's contribution to global peacekeeping. I think it's a priority also for the government and for the leadership. I think it's a very visible and tangible way in which Vietnam can contribute as a good global citizen to help the UN in its peace and security role in some of the most difficult and troubled parts of the world. And I think for a country to be able to do that now, given the situation for 35 years when Vietnam was in conflict, is a huge, it's a wonderful sort of symbolically, but also substantially, a wonderful way for a country to give back to the international system. So these are a couple of examples that I would mention at this time and going forward.
obviously Vietnam has transitioned from being mainly a beneficiary of UN support to actually becoming an active contributor to UN's activities.
You mention about 6 pillars for people?
Sure. The 6 pillars are, we have the one plan, which is our one strategic plan for all the UN agencies. We have a one common budgetary framework. We have one leader, which is me and the country team that I chair. We have one harmonized set of management practices. We have one voice, which is our one communications. And of course, we have in Vietnam the special 6th one, which is the one green UN house, which I mentioned earlier. So we have these 5 ones in all such countries, but in Vietnam we have a 6th one, which is a facilitator of many of the other ones.
Right.
How about the budgetary problem or issue now with the one UN?
Yeah, I mean, we have a challenging situation. I mean, if you're going into this is where Vietnam can help, because, you know, Vietnam has reached a stage of its development where it's no longer classified as a low-income country. It's classified as a lower middle-income country since 2010. As a result, a lot of the bilateral donors have withdrawn their development assistance programs or have cut them significantly. And as a result, the one fund that we had has largely been depleted before I came. So, you know, we are not getting new contributions from donors to the one fund for Vietnam because they feel that Vietnam is now in a much better position to contribute itself to its own development. And I think one of the big challenges right now is to get the government of Vietnam to understand and to make much larger, what we call government cost-sharing contributions to the government's own priorities. This is not the UN's priorities. These are the priorities for Vietnam. So I think that one of the big challenges going forward is a much larger amount of domestic resource mobilization and contribution out of that by Vietnam to its own development to replace the funds that for many decades have come from outside. So I think that is a big challenge.
One Strategic Plan 2017-2021 is the official name for the direction of delivering UN support to the government of Vietnam in the next 5 years. The $423 million budget is planned mostly for these 4 things, making sure that those that have not had a fair chance to enjoy the benefits of Vietnam's economic development will catch up. Vietnam doesn't become a major greenhouse gas emitter as it pushes forward with its economic success story. Vietnam will have a new economic growth model to increase productivity and competitiveness as momentum has slowed. More people will be brought in the decision-making process.
Do you think this is a very ambitious plan just for 5 years?
The plan the UN has is always ambitious, but it's an ongoing process. This is the 3rd such plan we've had. We have a higher chance of having effectiveness if we are all working together in one UN, in one coherent manner. So yes, it is ambitious, but I'm sure, you know, we can make a big contribution.
Thank you very much.
So talking of moving forward, in a previous interview with Vietnam Television, you actually mentioned that there are great contributions coming from the UN to Vietnam in the future as well. Can you explain to us what these might be and how these might impact Vietnam?
Well, I think the big contributions are in all these 4 areas that I have mentioned. We have a huge program on climate change, for example. Just last week, I signed with the government the first ever Green Climate Fund grant to Vietnam for the first time. between UNDP and the government of Vietnam for more than $30 million, which will help increase the resilience of communities and reduce their vulnerabilities to climate change and to El Nino. So that's an example. That's a very concrete example of something that I just signed. We have major efforts in the area of helping Vietnam to increase its productivity and its competitiveness, which is going to be critical if Vietnam is going to move to the next economic stage and avoid the middle income trap. I've personally worked on these issues for 20 years in this region, so I'm particularly keen, my own background as an economist, working on these issues, I think allows me to bring the best international expertise to Vietnam. We have UNICEF working on the juvenile justice system in terms of reform. So, you know, as I said, there are 18 different UN agencies that have signed the One Strategic Plan. I can name a whole range of very specific issues that we will be continuing to bring our best expertise, best examples, and ready to provide any policy advice to the government.
Ambassador Binh, from Vietnam's perspective, what will Vietnam want to contribute to the UN in the future to enrich this partnership?
We want to contribute our experience, development experience, and also what we have some sort of strength, like in terms of agricultural development, how we recover and then develop, we resolve difficult issues with regard to from the hygiene, the food, to the production, and then to other areas of production, so that we can help. We can provide help and experience to other countries that need, such experience. At the same time, we also can contribute, our resources, in different areas. And later on, when we develop our expertise, we can join the, the UN team in different aspects, So together, to develop the UN vision in elsewhere in the world, in different places, so that to contribute, to the international peace and security aspect as a member and responsible, member. So whatever we can do, I mean, from the political aspect to other aspect, I think Vietnam will be happy to develop its relation with the UN.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for all your interesting insights and your great experience too. I wish you the best of luck with your future endeavours, and I look forward to seeing the relationship between Vietnam and the UN prosper in the years to come.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And that has wrapped up this edition of Talk Vietnam. We hope that through this episode you now appreciate the membership that Vietnam currently holds at the UN, as well as the contributions that the UN has made to Vietnam in its history of socio-economic development. That's it for this edition of Talk Vietnam. Goodbye for now, and until next time.